So, hi everyone. Good day, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome and thank you for joining us at the launch of the report titled Making Institutions Count, Strengthening Support for Women Human Rights Defenders in Asia by National Human Rights Institutions. My name is Julio Castor Achmadi. I'm the National Human Rights Institution Program Officer at Forum Asia. And we are the ANNI Secretariat. Forum Asia is the ANNI Secretariat, the Asian NGO network on national human rights institution who work to strengthen the work and also functioning of Asian NHRIs to be able to comply to the Paris Principles. First of all, I would like to say thank you so much for ANNI members and also colleagues at Forum Asia who have contributed to this report on women human rights defenders and also NHRIs. And then also for the APF for supporting the development of the report, as well as contributing and also collaborating with us for the launch. And then lastly, for our speakers today, we have here Karen Gomez-Dampit, Ambika Satkunanathan, Kieran Fitzpatrick, and also Vita Yundani. So we have gathered here stakeholders on national human rights institution advocacy. So we have those from CSOs, we have those who are from the NHRIs, and also regional institutions or organizations who have a view on how CSOs and also national human rights institutions could work together, especially to strengthen the support and better protection for women human rights defenders. Last year in June 2021, Forum Asia and also ANNI conducted an event on how can NHRIs better protect women human rights defender at the 9th Asian Human Rights Defender Forum supported by the APF. During the event, we discussed and also reflected on how important the role of NHRIs in order to protect and also enhance better support for women human rights defender in Asia. So those discussions are now reflected in the written form of this report. The report also highlights the analysis on the women human rights defender situation between 2019 to 2021. We discussed the concerns and also challenges faced by women human rights defenders, especially when they are engaging with national human rights institutions. And then lastly, we provided recommendations, the way forward on how NHRIs in Asia could better offer their support and extend their protection for women human rights defenders in the region. So as we all might know, women human rights defenders are those who identify as women and conduct or defend the human rights, and also any individuals or organizations who work on women human rights and also gender equality. So in this regard, women human rights defenders, based on the nature of their work, they face different layers of violence and also risk, which are often uncommon to be experienced by other human rights defenders. For example, male human rights defenders. So sexual and gender-based violence, including sexual harassment and also rape threats, and also raping as an incident in many cases. Stigmatizations because they are women, because they identify as women, attacks on their body authority and autonomy, and also attacks against their private life. So in many cases, we see that women human rights defenders, when they are being attacked, it's not only them, but also their family, their children, their properties. So we see an attack not only because of they are women, because they identify as women, but also those who are related to them in their private life. And those are all in addition to the common attacks and also intimidations and threats experienced by other human rights defenders, such as physical attacks, doxings, and now we see a lot of digital attacks as well against human rights defenders. So we can see different dimensions of vulnerabilities that are experienced by women human rights defenders as opposed to the other defenders. As ANNI and also Forum Asia, with all of the members, are continuing to monitor and also document attacks and cases on human rights defenders and the role of national human rights institutions, we acknowledge that there are positive progress and positive developments made by national human rights institution in order to better protect women human rights defenders. But we have also identified the needs of women human rights defenders to be further protected by these institutions as a unique organization that has a legal mandate to protect and also promote human rights. So the report here highlights all of the things that we want to express to the general public and also to discuss more strategies in order for NHRIs to be able to better protect women human rights defenders in the region. So without any further ado, I present to you the report, Making Institutions Count, Strengthening Support for Women Human Rights Defenders in Asia by National Human Rights Institutions. My colleague Shomira will be presenting the findings, and also with Nhri from Human Rights Defender Program at Forum Asia in the next session. So that will be all from me. Thank you so much for everyone who have attended and participated in the discussion. I'm sorry that we could not make this offline, but I'm very glad to have seen some of you here at the moment. Thank you again for the speakers, and I'll be passing it over to my colleague Shomira and also Nhri. Thank you and have a fruitful discussion today.
Thank you so much, Nhri, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning to our event on women human rights defenders and what NHRIs can do to protect them better. Without wasting time, we'll get into the findings of the report. My colleague has already given an overview of what is contained in the report, and we'll be discussing some of the findings before we proceed to talk about the different panelists and their views on this issue as well. I'm just going to share my screen. Please give me a second. Yes, my colleague Nhri will be presenting along with me. Nhri, just a second, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shomira and Julio. I'll present the statistics of the violations against women human rights defenders that we have documented from 2019 to 2021, the 3-year period. And in our documentation, we have used the term WHRDs as referring to any women defending human rights, as well as NGOs and persons of any gender supporting women's rights or gender-related issues. And in our documentation, we've observed that WHRDs have been among the group of defenders most affected by violations, and also they continue to be subject to disproportionate targeting as a result of their work. In the past 3 years, we documented 460 cases of violations against WHRDs out of the 1899 total cases. And this we've recorded in across 21 countries. So that means, like, out of all the incidents, 1 out of 4 in every 1 out of 4 incidents has impacted WHRDs. And also in terms of the perpetrators, we can see that 382 out of 460 violations, we see the state actor being involved. This is like a huge proportion. 83% of the violators are state actors. And in terms of the categories of the violations against WHRDs, we see, Somira, next slide. In terms of the categories of violations, we can see that the maximum violations committed against WHRDs is judicial harassment. The 270 cases of violations we've recorded, and out of these, the 200, this is mostly coupled by arrest and detention. You can see 210 WHRDs were affected in this, with arrest and detention is 100 and 200, same arrest and detention, and mostly these arrests are arbitrary. And then we can see 107 cases of intimidation and threats against WHRDs during this period, and 97 cases of physical violence, out of which 21 resulted in the deaths of WHRDs. Next slide, Somira. Thank you. And out of those cases, we can also see that the WHRDs face further set of challenges in addition to what other group of defenders face, as the WHRDs were not only targeted for their work and activism, but also for their identity as women. And as they like challenge these dominant patriarchal structures like societal, cultural, and religious norms, we can see there is increase of gender-based harassment, and which we've documented in different forms of violations. Like in terms of vilification, we've seen that out of 115, we've documented 50. In 50, we have seen that has affected WHRDs, and also these forms of violations are in terms of targeting as sexual assaults, and also there have been derogatory remarks against them, and in terms of use of misogynist language as well. And another worrying trend we are seeing is that most attacks against the WHRDs are also in the online space. We have documented that they have been the second group of defenders most affected by these online attacks, intimidation, and threats, and particularly in online spaces, including social media. WHRDs face violence, sexual harassment, and rape and death threats, and this in these instances mostly the perpetrators are online trolls and also fundamentalist groups. And another trend that we've documented is that WHRDs not only they are threatened, but also their family members are threatened, and this we've seen that is a tactic to intimidate them and also hinder their work. And in 2019, we had conducted a series of interviews with WHRDs, and our findings were that, like, aside from their safety, their well-being was also affected as a consequence of the stress arising from these challenging dominant gender structures and narratives, and which are generally normalized against the WHRDs. And among the interviews we conducted, the WHRD also emphasized that their role as primary caregivers in families and communities, and also conducting this unpaid domestic work contributed to additional factors that undermine their well-being. And this is our documentation, and of course this is not the complete picture. There are a lot of unreported cases, and also because of the stigma associated with it, they don't come out as well. So this also is contributing to an incomplete picture, but from what we've managed to document, so these are our findings. I'll hand it over to Samira. Thank you.
Thank you, Nhri. We, as has already been mentioned, we had an event last year where understanding full well that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to the situation of WHRDs in Asia, but also what NHRIs can do to help them better. And some of the challenges and concerns that we found, which were shared, of course, by WHRDs themselves, but also NHRIs in their functioning, primarily was, of course, the first and foremost was that representation and leadership within NHRIs. A lot of WHRDs felt that there should be more space for women or WHRDs or trans individuals to be represented in leadership and administrative positions within NHRIs, because this will give better representation to their cause. The other concern was that there are non-existent or weak policies on not just HRDs in Asia, but also women human rights defenders in particular. Most countries in Asia do not have any legislation or policy specific to WHRDs. So this can be quite a concern to address specific challenges relating to them. The other thing which has been already discussed by my colleague Nhri is that there is a constant vilification of WHRDs and what they do. So there are physical attacks, online attacks, and in general, it is a very difficult working environment for most women human rights defenders in the region. Other than this, the other concerns that both WHRDs and NHRIs raised was that we're seeing increasingly authoritarian governments in Asia and repressive laws coming in. So these are affecting the functioning of NHRIs to be able to adequately address the concerns of human rights defenders and women human rights defenders in general. There's a lack of trust between civil society and the NHRI for multiple reasons, some of which have already been mentioned earlier. There is a lack of independence, resources and awareness within NHRIs on a lot of times, because there is not a lot of space to be working on these issues in particular, or they are unable to for monetary constraints or financial constraints. There have also been changes in the status and functioning of NHRIs during political upheavals. We've seen some very drastic political changes in the last year and a half in Asia, and these have affected NHRIs in functioning to their optimum capacity to be able to help women human rights defenders. And finally, NHRIs as human rights defenders themselves do face threats on a lot of occasions. This is also hindering their work. And these were some of the broad concerns and challenges that were raised during the session. Moving on, we asked participants of our session last year that what can civil society, other stakeholders and NHRIs do in such a circumstance? We wanted to look at possible solutions or some ideas that people could present on what is it that we can all do to address the situation of WHRDs in the region. First and foremost, as was already mentioned, but participants all felt that there should be a much stronger focus on representation and leadership. This will signal a change in the way NHRIs are functioning, but also have more representation of women and LGBTIQ individuals in positions of power who can affect change. There should be initiatives to foster trust between NHRIs and civil society. There should be strengthening of local networks of NHRIs, and this way NHRIs at the national level, WHRDs at the national level, can bring attention, international attention to their own cause specific to their country. Other than this, there are certain countries where there are multiple national institutions, not just the main NHRI, but also other institutions. And some participants said that there should be better communication within these institutions to be able to collectively address the concerns that are coming to the fore. We received a suggestion on feminist documentation, which is for WHRDs to talk about their own lived experiences, to document all the cases, the challenges, their experiences, so that we do have more solidarity among the shared experiences of WHRDs in the region. Along with this, not just at the national level engagement, but there have been suggestions to engage more closely with UN mechanisms such as the Universal Periodic Review and special procedure mandates. They've spoken about having support groups within country or by NHRIs, and also training opportunities for WHRDs to be able to come together and learn how they can navigate the system or their working environments in a much better way, and how they can engage with NHRIs or other national and international institutions. There is always, of course, room for advocacy and awareness building on the cases of WHRDs and sensitizing institutions to their cause. Another very important factor which came out, another important point which came out from our discussion was to focus on psychosocial well-being. This is an aspect which gets left out because WHRDs are not only facing attacks from external actors, state, non-state actors, but oftentimes from family members themselves, or they see attacks to their family members, on their family members. And for this, for their families to cope with this, for themselves to cope with this, psychosocial well-being becomes very important. And finally, funding and technical assistance. So this is a concern which did get raised both by WHRDs and NHRIs, is that there is a lot more need for funding to be coming in to support NHRIs to be supporting WHRDs better. In conclusion, some of the findings of our report were that there is a need for greater support and recognition of WHRD situation by all stakeholders. This would include NHRIs, donors, CSOs, regional and international networks. We found that there is a need for gender-specific responses by NHRIs, very focused and specific to WHRDs, a need for developing specific protection measures and legislations for them, and effective and strong implementation of instruments and action plans by NHRIs. These are instruments or action plans that are already in place but need stronger implementation. Other than this, when it comes to a civil society perspective, there is a need for constant documentation of human rights violations against WHRDs, which is where organizations like Forum Asia and networks like ANNI can come in, who can raise these violations with NHRIs and stakeholders at various levels, such as the regional and international level. And finally, for regional networks like the APF to liaise constantly with NHRIs, CSOs, and governments to advocate for stronger protection mechanisms for WHRDs, and also for them to effectively implement the regional action plan on HRDs, which was released last year. And one of our panelists, Mr. Kiran, will be talking about this soon. And these were the broad conclusions and findings of our report. And of course, if for those who are interested in reading the full report, the report is now live and it exists on the Forum Asia website. So we do encourage you to please have a look, please have a read, because we're really hoping that this can be used as an advocacy tool by both CSOs and NHRIs and any other stakeholders who are interested in understanding the challenges of WHRDs and institutions and how we can make the Asian region a more enabling environment in different countries for WHRDs to work. So thank you so much. This would be our presentation. And now I think we can move into our panel discussion. So we have 4 distinguished speakers with us today to talk about this issue from various perspectives. And I can introduce them briefly. So we have Wita Yudhani from the Institute for Policy Research and Advocacy, or ELSAM, in Indonesia. She's the advocacy officer. We have Commissioner Karen Gomez-Dumpit from the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. She has an extensive bio, which you can find it, and she's done a lot of work in this region, in Philippines as well. So we will be introducing her to speak about an NHRI perspective on this issue. We have Ms. Ambika Satyanathan from Sri Lanka. She is a former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka and also at present a fellow of the Open Society Foundations. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Kiran Fitzpatrick, who is the director of the Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions. So welcome everyone to this panel discussion. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. I would like to speak first about a civil society perspective on this issue, because we wanted to hear about the situation of WHRDs in different countries. And I invite Wita to talk about the situation of WHRDs in Indonesia and what ELSAM has been finding through its documentation and research. So Wita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira. And before that, I'd like to share my screen. Is that already seen from your side, Samira? All right. Okay. Greetings from Indonesia. My name is Vita. I'm an advocacy officer from the Institute for Policy Research and Advocacy, or known as ELSAM. ELSAM is a human rights-based organization that operates in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta City. We have been working since 1993 to ensure the evidence-based policy made by the government of Indonesia as the way to ensure the protection, respect, fulfillment, and the promotion of human rights in Indonesia. And one of our main focuses is the human rights defender, both in the capacity building and also the knowledge advancing. So today's topic is very relatable to our work. And we would like to thank to Forum Asia, ANNI, and IPF for this amazing chance and amazing event, and also as well as the report. We are so thankful for this chance. And speaking of human rights defender, as Shomira and Nhri already point out, the situation of the human rights defender is indeed vulnerable. But this vulnerability is not because they are weak or they are lazy to do the advocacy work. Instead, it is because of the external factor which exists to silence the human rights defender effort to defend the human rights. And these external factors can be manifested in the criminalization, cyber attack, physical attack, and any other intimidation form that already mentioned by Nhri in previous presentations. And what makes the women human rights defender different from any other form of HRDs are the gender-based violence. And before I want to explore the women human rights defender, I'd like to raise the need that we need to use the intersectionality approach when we are talking about women, because women's situation around the world, around the nation are different because of their background. For example, like the wheels that I show you in this presentation, from the socioeconomic status, and then the religion and belief system, sexual orientation, education access, until the geographic location are indeed the factors that shape a reality of women. So the use of intersectional approach can bring the just analysis, because it draws the overlapping backgrounds both in experience and identity that can create the difference of discrimination against women. And then we can see the interaction between those discrimination and also the subordination that could shape the women's relative position. Hence, when we are talking about women human rights defender, we have to be careful when we need to analyze their positions. And in this regard, I'd like to acknowledge that my presentation is based on the Indonesia situation. So next, I'd like to point out the roots of vulnerability of women human rights defender. It's because of two roots. It is based on the Komnas Perempuan research and report. Komnas Perempuan is a national human rights institution that dedicates their life to monitor and support the women's rights implementation in Indonesia, besides our National Commission on Human Rights. But again, for the roots of the vulnerability, the first one is affected by the patriarchal practices in our societal system. The male-dominated perspective affects on how most of people see women human rights defender. And women human rights defender, as Shamira has pointed out, that we and women human rights defenders are seeing from their bodily and their sexual aspect. And the second one is related to the first root. It's the stereotype and the expected gender roles, and those appear as the reason of attack. And regarding the stereotype and gender roles, it is people expect women to stay at home or not to do the protest, but the women human rights defender do the other thing. So the stereotype and gender role appears as the attack for them. And then it can be seen again from the Komnas Perempuan report that launched in 2021, but this is the data from the 2019 until 2020. Komnas Perempuan stated that there has been the increased number on how women human rights defenders have to deal with the repressive acts. And then this repressive acts included in psychological, physical, and sexual aspect. And the abuser are the perpetrator family. The perpetrator family are the parties from the abuser of the victim that the women human rights defender defend to. And then the second one is unidentified individuals. And then the third one is the actor that supposedly protect us, but they do the repressive acts towards the women human rights defender. It's the law enforcement officials. And based on those situations, I'd like to point out the Danish Institute statement that women human rights defenders are persecuted for what they do, of course, because we defend something that most of people cannot fully accept it, but also who they are. It's because of their identity as a woman. So this is a very highly political situation. And I'm sorry. And there are some women try to against the oath. And I'd like to highlight the cases that based on ELSAM Environmental Human Rights Defender Monitoring Report on 2021, and then our research report on tourism business in 2020. The first one is the woman Raditya Butowe in East Nusa Tenggara. They try to defend their land, their rights to health, environment situation. They try to blockade all the activities in this development process. They even try to, try to protest with the topless actions. And this action are also implemented with by the mothers in Sigabitan village. It happened in North Sumatra. They try to carry out the similar protest. They try to protect their land from the exploitation by the state, because Indonesia government want to expand the business in the business of tourism in the Lake Toba. And then the last one of example is the farmer groups that collaborate with the women there to protect their environment and their family from the land grabbing acts that really bring drawbacks to their life. Many women cannot be fully protect their family because of their resource of life is limited due to the land grabbing. And actually, in response to those problems, actually, the National Commission of Human Rights, or Komnas HAM in Indonesia language, already serve best practice. They already launched the Commissioner Regulation number 5 at the year of 2015. This regulation is the way to ensure to protect the human rights defender. Although it is a general human rights defender, it is a breakthrough for Indonesia to protect the human rights defender. And fast forward 5 years later, in previous year, in 2021, we already have the standard norm and regulation, or SNP, we call it in the Indonesia language, number 5. It's about the human rights defender. This SNM exists as the guidance for any stakeholder to implement the protection for women human rights defender. And the good thing from this SNP is it is already mainstream the women human rights defender situation and try to acknowledge the differentiation between the quote unquote ordinary human rights defender and women human rights defender. And our note, even though it is a best practice, it needs still further assessment because there are still emerging cases. And one of them comes from our ANNI members colleagues at Contrast. Maybe some of you already heard about the case of criminalization against our friends. I use the initial here. Our fellow women human rights defender, our friends had to deal with the defamation suit by the one of public officials. The stakeholders that should be use their power to protect us, but they try to sue us. And it happened after she and our fellow human rights defender discussed their research findings on natural resource management that allegedly involve the public officials. And since then, our friend's security has been remained critical because she had to deal with the data breaching and then any other form of repressive acts towards her. And then this is our recommendations based on the situations. I call it a tangible recommendation because it is the thing that we should progressively try to actualize. We need the national law to protect the human rights defender, but there is a long way to go. There is a long process of advocacy. So in order to fill the void, we can do this 3 points. The first one is gender mainstreaming, the gender perspective. Maybe it seems very ordinary, but it is important to use again and again the gender perspective in regulations because it can progressing the goal to protect human rights defender under the national law. And so we can be more sensitive to the gender issues and especially for the women human rights defender situations. And then the second one is the collaboration between national human rights institutions. In Indonesia, we have more than one national human rights institution. So we think that they can collaborate more to disseminate the commissioner regulation and also the SNP of human rights defender, because it can ensure the capacity building and cross knowledge among the state officials, especially because after all, the state are the stakeholder, the key stakeholder to implement and enforce the law. And then the last one is we think that we need to change the existing law that can hamper the life of women human rights defender and also human rights defender in general. For example, like the law of electronic information and transactions, because many cases use this law as the way to silence the human rights defender and especially the women human rights defenders. And it really affected to their freedom to express the needs to defend the right and their groups of victims that need to be defended too. All right, that's all from my presentations. And again, I'd like to say congratulations for Forum Asia, ANNI, and ICA for the report. It is a remarkable output that because we can use this as the advocacy tools, as Samira has mentioned. And this is a great way to document the activity of women human rights defenders. And we also hope that it can be implemented in the next few years. Again, back to Samira. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vita, for your wonderful presentation. Of course, it's a very sobering reminder of the cases that exist in, of course, Indonesia, but other countries as well. And also for highlighting the intersectional aspect. This is something we've already spoken about, but I think we need to talk more about how the different identities of WHRDs, women, LGBTIQ individuals come into question, are affecting the way they're able to operate in society and how this affects the work that they do. And for all our everyone who's watching today, Vita and her colleagues have written a wonderful chapter in the report itself on the situation of WHRDs in Indonesia. So we really encourage you to read that as well, to know a lot more about what is happening in Indonesia right now. Not every country is in the position where Indonesia is, perhaps in terms of regulations or procedures. She's already mentioned about the standard norms and procedures for HRDs which exist. But again, this has come through a lot of efforts of civil society, engagement with the NHRI, and we hope that other countries too can replicate something like this in the coming years as well. Thank you so much, Vita. On that note, and I think this is a wonderful note to be passing over to our next panelist. So our next panelist is Commissioner Karen. Commissioner Karen is with the CHRP in the Philippines. She has been working with the CHRP for the last 28 years. At present, she is the focal point on gender equality and women's human rights. But also Commissioner Karen herself, as a WHRD, is in a position to talk about the situation of working in the Philippines. So thank you so much, Commissioner Karen, and we'd love to hear from you more about, of course, how the CHRP, the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, has been addressing WHRDs' cases, but also your personal experience as a commissioner and women human rights defender. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shamira, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists. Well, first of all, congratulations to Forum Asia, ANNI, and thank you to APF and SIDA for their support for this forum and the work that has been put into the report, making institutions count, strengthening support for WHRDs in Asia by national human rights institutions. Developments in the Philippines show that women human rights defenders are being subjected to particularly gendered and sexist attacks in both offline and online spaces. The attacks are responses to WHRD's active opposition to government policies and calls for accountability. Attacks on women human rights defenders in the Philippines vary. There have been reports of disappearances or killings. A great number have been harassed, criminalized, or effectively removed from office, foremost of which is the case of our former Commission on Human Rights Chairperson and currently Senator Laila De Lima. Journalist Maria Ressa has been slapped with a slew of cyber libel and tax cases as well. There is stark rise in misogyny at the highest levels of public office. Vile sexist remarks and rape jokes have been uttered multiple times, defended, trivialized, and normalized in press briefings by high officials and administration support groups. Women challenging this wide practice in government and calling for accountability of such behavior have been made the subject of scorn and attack in both online and offline spaces. Misogyny and fake news mark the attacks used to discredit, shame, persecute, and bully women human rights defenders. Mainstream as well as new media have been used as platforms to launch these assaults and create a disabling environment for women human rights defenders. Opposition Senator De Lima, for example, was subjected to criminal prosecution after publicly denouncing the bloodshed attended by the president's flagship campaign against illegal drugs. And she is still in detention for 5 years today. And since her calls for accountability and vocal opposition to the government's drug war, she has been prevented from fully performing her duties as an elected official through her incarceration, including the conduct of public hearings as a duly elected legislator. So if a WHRD in high-level positions were intimidated through the weaponization of the law, these women were assaulted on the basis of their gender, demonized for holding opinions critical of the administration's programs, or neutralized to render immobile the exercise of their respective professions and as a human rights or as a woman human rights defender. Women peasant leaders or Lumad leaders, indigenous peoples, are all the more challenged to oppose the culture of misogyny. They face great security risk. They are even more burdened by performing multiple roles for their community and families, exacerbated by the insecurity of being a woman human rights defender. With the rampant violence against these women, there remains the challenge of legal scrutiny and documentation for those community-based women human rights defender victims who are poor, marginalized, and alone. There are campaigns by women that arose to push back and address these attacks. Movements like Babae Ako or I Am Woman and Every Woman has helped shed light on the sexist aggressions of the administration. Broad support of women from all over the Philippines took to social media to express dissent against the pervading oppressive practice. Movements have also walked out on streets to protest the current situation. The Commission, as a gender ombud, is doing its part in highlighting women's human rights violations in relation to WHRDs. It has issued, or we have issued, advisories against misogynistic comments and sexist aggressions. We have investigated women human rights defender cases, and the recent of which are cases of the arrest of women and child rights advocate Sally Ohano and medical worker Dr. Nati Castro, whose cases involve rebellion against the government in the case of Sally Ohano and Dr. Nati Castro in the fight against the armed communist armed movement in the country, or what we call red tagging. We have also established a reporting portal on gender-based violence through our Gender-Based Violence Observatory program, aimed to collect data on various forms of gender-based violence and examine the functionality and efficacy of mechanisms responding to act against gender-based violence in the country. In the case of Lumads and peasant groups in the Philippines, who are among the stalwart human rights defenders for the right to self-determination, land, and genuine peace, reporting violations and general human rights conditions often does not account for the women leaders who face specific risks relative to their male counterparts. So reporting sometimes escape the violence experienced by these community WHRDs. While we have considerable legal mechanisms instituted in the Philippines for the protection of women's human rights, these mechanisms are under stress. Mainstreaming gender, nevertheless, needs to be strengthened and optimized to truly feel its impact on the lives of women and, of course, women human rights defenders. So vigilance is needed to advance the movement of women's human rights, encouraging international solidarity to call out governments in its harmful practices, and stressing the state obligation to strengthen the protection of the rights of women human rights defenders. Relevant to this is ensuring safe spaces for organized peaceful movement to express their dissent, like campaigns that arose from the Philippines. There is opportunity in digital media for women in all walks of life to participate in the movement when it is made safer through enforcement of laws against gender-based violence. Support from international mechanisms in monitoring human rights violations is also indispensable in the protection of WHRDs in situations of hostile and misogynist government administrations. All over the world, women human rights defenders are silenced not only because they advocate for human rights and in particular women and girls' human rights. They are also targeted as a result of prevailing patriarchal culture, discrimination, and stereotypes that silence and target women who speak out and who claim spaces and who fight. Women human rights defenders are also targeted by sexist and misogynistic attacks. Women leaders, because of their continued call for accountability and focus on the rising impunity and misogyny, regularly vilified and targeted. So just to say that I am a woman human rights defender, I don't want to romanticize attacks against me as I work as a commissioner of the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines and only 8 days remaining till my term ends. But just as I have shared, I am in a better position. And if we are going to ensure protection for HRDs in general and women human rights defenders in particular, we need to focus our efforts to ensure that no one is left behind. We have issued the report on our inquiry on the situation of human rights defenders last year and demonstrated our role as a national human rights institution the best way we can. And we want to matter better so WHRDs can count on us to strengthen the promotion and protection of all defenders. Again, we are grateful for the documentation in this report and the recommendations. We hope that we will continue safe spaces for discussion to ensure that women human rights defenders' narratives are told and their voices are heard. And from there, we can act in solidarity for the promotion and protection for women who fight for women. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Karen, for your views on this, your experience as a commissioner of the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. I think we really appreciate having an NHRI perspective on this as well. You yourself are a WHRD, but as you rightly mentioned, you are in a position of being commissioner, but there are, of course, so many WHRDs whose cases and violations against them are on an everyday basis, and these need to be heard. So thank you so much for making a very strong case for NHRIs to step up and to work towards the strong protection mechanisms for WHRD protection. And we do hope in the coming days as well, even after your term is over, we will see very positive measures of the CHRP continuing, because I think that serves as a wonderful example about how institutions can be used, people within institutions can initiate measures which can go a long way in protection of WHRD. So thank you so much, Commissioner Karen. And I think moving on, this of course links to our next question, which would be about what can NHRIs and civil society do together to address this concern? Because we've identified that there are, of course, a lot of challenges, but also based on our report, what is it that institutions along with civil society organizations can do? And I think at this stage, it would be wonderful to bring in our next speaker, Ms. Ambika Satyanathan, who, as I've mentioned previously, she has been the former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, but is also an active member of civil society. Presently, she is a fellow at the Open Society Foundations and has a strong civil society background as well, of having worked many years on several issues. So welcome, Ms. Ambika. We'd love to hear from you because you've straddled both these roles. You've been in an NHRI, but also as a civil society member. And we'd love to hear from you further about what is it that, based on your experience, that NHRIs and civil societies can do together. How can we come together to address the challenges that WHRDs are facing, the situation of WHRDs in Asia, and how these two can be combined. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamira. I think perhaps I would like to also begin by talking a little bit about what is happened or what has happened to the Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka, because I think that is relevant to the relationship that civil society has with the Human Rights Commission. So in 2015, with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, the Human Rights Commission became independent, and the process of appointment of its membership became more transparent, independent, which meant that the president was not the sole authority who had the power to make these decisions, but that it was done by a multi-member constitutional council, that people applied or nominated persons for these positions, that these positions were advertised. So it was not ideal, but it increased the transparency and independence. And I think that had a key role to play in the trust that previously, due to the previous 10 years when the commission was not independent, civil society did not have a close relationship with the commission because there was a lack of trust. And this enabled the rebuilding of trust, and for civil society to think that they must now start engaging and working with the commission. This is extremely important. But once again, what has happened now with the 20th Amendment to the Constitution that was passed last year is that the independence of the commission has been undermined. The commission is once again, the members of the commission once again appointed solely by the president. And also the appointment of the membership has been severely flawed, because we find people with no experience of working on human rights or no qualifications being appointed to the positions. And also the diversity of the communities in Sri Lanka is not reflected. For instance, there is still no Muslim member of the Human Rights Commission. The chairperson was, changed a few months ago, and that has had a positive impact because the current chairperson has taken strong positions on critical human rights issues. But the problem here is that we are focused, or the commission has been reliant on individuals and personalities. The structural systemic problems have not been tackled. They remained, and they are exacerbated by the lack of independence. So how much an individual, whether the chair or a commissioner, can do can be and is curtailed to a large extent. And what the person does in terms of taking specific positions may not always have an impact on how the institution functions, particularly at the grassroots community levels. So we've had, civil society, women human rights defenders being subject to harassment and surveillance by security agencies. They visit CSOs, including the ones that are run by WHRDs, and most often focusing on issues related to women. They demand that they provide information about the staff, and this jeopardizes the safety and security of particularly these women. Then this also prevents them from working on human rights issues in vulnerable groups, such as former combatants. In this group, the women former combatants are particularly vulnerable, but this constant monitoring and surveillance by the security agencies prevents these WHRDs and civil society organizations from providing support to these groups. Then we have another example is the families of the disappeared. These are mostly women, and they have been protesting now for close to 1,900 days. They are mostly in the north and the east, which are the conflict-affected areas. As I said, they're mostly women, and they're mostly women heads of households. So they are extremely vulnerable. And you find security agencies visit these houses, which are often in remote areas, jeopardizing their safety and security. They're summoned to the Terrorism Investigation Division for inquiry. They receive phone calls prior to demonstration, asking them where they are they participating, all of which makes them extremely vulnerable. Now, what can and should the Human Rights Commission be doing in this context? Many of the WHRDs also work with women survivors of SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence. The main problem in the SGBV is the lack of action by state institutions, particularly the police. So when I was at the Human Rights Commission, a large number of complaints that we received and which we had a mandate to inquire into was in relation to inaction by the police, that people would go and make complaints. And it is quite common here, if you make a complaint about domestic violence, the police will dismiss it, they won't take it seriously, and they will, or they might try to reconcile the parties. So in dealing with the police, the WHRDs face a lot of hostility themselves. What can the Human Rights Commission do? What it should do is it should inquire into these complaints and put pressure on the police. But we find that that doesn't often happen because the complaints of police inaction in particular are not given or not given due importance by the staff of the commission. Now, this is something that I speak from my experience. At the same time, it also points to a dysfunctional public sector, particularly institutions that are supposed to provide remedies for rights violations. Therefore, what the commission can do in this instance might also be limited because the larger structure itself is dysfunctional and needs to be reformed. The impact the commission can have in this instance would be limited. A large part of it is also due to lack of independence and politicization of all these institutions, including the police. And also, when the Human Rights Commission is not independent, what I find now is that many HRDs, WHRDs, they're reluctant to make complaints because, excuse me, they think that no action will be taken, or they think that it will lead to reprisals against them by these institutions about which they make complaints. And also when they face reprisals, there have been instances when the Human Rights Commission has not, in recent times, has not stepped up. And also there are complaints made that certain kinds of complaints are not being accepted by the commission. For instance, complaints of intimidation, of surveillance by security agencies. There have been noted cases of bias in favor of police. This existed even when I was in the commission. And what is happening is that the victim is made to feel that they're blowing the issue out of proportion or they're being unreasonable. What we need here are staff who are committed to, it might seem quite rather basic and simple, but that is a fundamental problem that we have, is committed to human rights, who are committed to progressive values, who are committed to protecting human rights, who are not statist, who are not biased in favor of the state and state entities. We need sensitive staff members, because there are also certain issues about which women may be reluctant to share with male officers. I'll give you an example, is that when I was at the commission, there was a WHRD who was working on sexual and reproductive health, working with women sex workers. And this person happened to be at a particular point on a road, and the police officers stopped her and they searched her handbag. When they searched her handbag, they found, because she works on sexual and reproductive health, they found a lot of condoms in the handbag. And because of that, they actually wanted to arrest her. So she came to the commission, and they did actually arrest her. And she came to the commission to make a complaint about this arbitrary arrest. So when she came to make a complaint, the duty officer at the time was a woman. And she instead, she refused to take the complaint. She lectured the woman, the WHRD who came to make the complaint, on proper behavior. advised, quote unquote, advised her and sent her away. So then she went and complained to another organization who actually called me. And it was then that I realized it had happened. I intervened, we accepted the complaint, etc. All going to show that the lack of awareness, the lack of commitment towards protecting human rights is a huge problem that we have to face. Another example is cyber violence. Where cyber violence is concerned, even the police have little understanding of the issue, and they do not view it as violence, and nor does the Human Rights Commission staff in many instances. So when the police fail to do their duty, you will find instances where the Commission also does not intervene. This is not only due to a lack of expertise or knowledge, but also patriarchal attitudes, sexism, misogyny, because of which not only the police, but also institutions that are supposed to intervene and provide remedies, such as the Human Rights Commission, they also might think that the women caused this, or the women did not behave in socially prescribed proper ways that led to this. And even here, I mean, Commissioner Karen mentioned about her position and how she was, although a WHRD, that she is in a better position because of her position as a member of the Commission. My personal experience was that when I was at the Commission, I was subjected to a lot of hate via anonymous letters, other forms of gendered hate. But the factor to note is that it is not always only gender. There are other intersecting factors which might make a person who is even in a position of power more vulnerable. So ethnicity, religion. So in a sense, I was subject to ethnicized hate because the labeling, I was labeled as LTTE, as terrorist. So I think we need to, sorry, we need to adopt a intersectional approach when looking at these issues, because patriarchy is deep-rooted and it is extremely challenging to change structures and systems. So when we talk about, entities such as the Human Rights Commission, we only look at, I think, the symptoms rather than the root causes, and we find ways interventions are also addressing the symptoms. So we think training programs need to, and usually it's training programs and we give them more funding to do projects. But what happens is that the training programs do not address, in many instances, do not address the root causes, which is patriarchy, which is prejudice, which is racism. Therefore, I think when we even formulate these awareness raising programs, they must not be only about the substance, but need to be about the root causes, which goes back to individual values, prejudices. Institutionally, as I said before, I would like to reiterate this, and I can't reiterate this strongly enough. It is extremely important that the Commission is viewed as an independent institution. So, not just in the way it functions, but also the way it is seen, which means it is integral that legally the Commission is independent, and it is incumbent upon the Commission as the state institution mandated to protect and promote human rights to make the overtures. So if the civil society is not approaching you, is not engaging with you, not working with you, then I think they need to figure out what the reasons are, and they need to be proactive in building that, in reaching out to civil society, in acting in ways that show them that they can trust them and build trust that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ambika, for your presentation. And I think a lot of the points that you have raised are echoing some of our findings as well in the report, but also what other speakers have spoken about. Thank you so much for speaking about, patriarchy is at the heart of this, prejudice is at the heart of a lot of things. Until we don't talk about it structurally, there is still going to be a very, very long way to go. So thank you so much for your views on this. And I think these are some issues Vita and Commissioner Karen have also raised. And I think it really resonates from a civil society perspective, of course, but moving forward as well for NHRIs, what they can do. And I think in this light, we'd like to bring in Mr. Kieran Fitzpatrick, who is the director of the APF. So welcome, Kieran, and we'd love to hear from you, of course, now that our other esteemed panelists have spoken about just, the situation of WHRDs in Asia as an overview, because you do, of course, work with several NHRIs in the region, and also about how a measure like the Regional Action Plan on HRDs can be utilized better by NHRIs to be addressing a lot of these concerns, or at least some of these concerns to start with. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Shamira. It's a real pleasure to be here. Can I pass on my congratulations to ANNI and Forum Asia and to my co-panelists for the presentation and the report. Can I just say it's an honour here to be speaking. At the Secretariat, we did consider whether it would be more appropriate to have one of our female staff members represent the APF at this particular session, given its focus on women human rights defenders. But we came to a decision that it'd be actually more important for me as director and as a man to actually indicate the commitment that the APF has with regards to human rights defenders more broadly, but specifically to women human rights defenders. And so with that, I'd like to basically give you an overview of the work that we have been doing with regards to our regional action plan, which does respond to many of the recommendations and conclusions in the report we're discussing here today. So, colleagues, there was a meeting, a global meeting in 2018, which developed a declaration called the Marrakesh Declaration, which focused on establishing a global framework about what actions national human rights institutions could take to support the rights of human rights defenders. As part of that, each of the 4 regional networks of national human rights institutions, and they are located in the Americas, in Africa, in Europe, and indeed in the Asia Pacific, I had to respond by developing a regional action plan about how we as regional networks would respond to this global declaration. We have done so. We've done so in collaboration with a number of our member institutions, institutions from Iraq, from Malaysia, from Palestine, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Afghanistan participated as a drafting committee for the Regional Action Plan. We also had an external reference group, which included the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from the United Nations, the International Service for Human Rights in Geneva, UNDP and UNEP. And I'm pleased to say that we also had representatives from Forum Asia and ANNI as part of that external reference group who provided input into the various actions that we'd place in our regional action plan. The other thing I'm really pleased about is that the Regional Action Plan explicitly highlights the increased risks faced by women human rights defenders and includes an engagement to focus support from the APF and its members for defenders in critical key areas, including business and human rights, disability rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer rights, and the right to a safe and healthy environment. Importantly, the Regional Action Plan recognises the central role that national human rights institutions can play in the defence of women human rights defenders, both as defenders of human rights defenders, but as, at times, human rights defenders themselves. So the plan contains a set of regional and national actions that the APF, as a collective network of institutions and our individual members, will implement from now to 2025 to improve the respect for the rights of defenders in the Asia Pacific. Now, at the regional level, these actions include 1, support in the development of regional policy making on human rights defenders, and I note that that is an issue that's raised in the report that we're discussing today, and there are recommendations on that. 2, to engage regional civil society actors and international partners. And again, that's one of the key recommendations in the report. And I think today is a demonstration of how the APF and Forum Asia and ANNI can work together in furthering both our objectives about stopping human rights violations against human rights defenders and women's human rights defenders. 3 is facilitating cooperation between national human rights institutions. Again, a recommendation in the report discussed today. 4, facilitate relocation and respite for human rights defenders. This is a new area of work for the APF, but one that is unfortunately taking up a significant amount of our time, energy and resources. In particular, colleagues would be aware that, or may be aware that, we've been focusing on the relocation of staff members of the Afghan Human Rights Commission who were under particular threat, with a particular focus on women staff members. I'm pleased to say that the APF has been successful in relocating approximately 500 individuals. That's staff members and their families from Afghanistan to a variety of third countries, and we're providing additional support once they're in their safe third country. Support to the establishment of national human rights institutions, that's a core function of the APF. That's one of the other regional activities. Development of regional data on human rights defenders. And I was really appreciative of the statistics that were discussed today at the beginning of this presentation on the number of cases that have been recorded about human rights violations to human rights defenders, and then the breakdown of that data with regards to gender, and then the subset breakdown of that data once again to the particular areas of the nature of the initiators of those violations. And finally, strengthen the capacity of national human rights institutions to deal with questions of the protection of human rights defenders. Again, one of the central recommendations in the report. We then have a further set of 8 actions that are focused not at the region but at the national level that we will assist our members to undertake. And I'll run through them. 1, advocate for national legal protections. We've been discussing that today in terms of the context that our members work in. 2, raise awareness of the rights of human rights defenders. 3, develop early warning systems. 4, monitor violations against human rights defenders. 5, report on the violations against human rights defenders. 6, engage with the international human rights system with regards to human rights defenders. 7, strengthen national networks of human rights defenders. And of course, not lastly, probably the most important with regards to our discussion today, promote gender equality and mainstream the recognition of women human rights defenders. So these actions will be complemented by a detailed monitoring and evaluation framework that'll track the implementation of all the recommendations and actions I've just discussed, and we'll do periodic and public reporting on our progress on the implementation of those recommendations. Now, I'd like to turn specifically now to the work that we will do with regards to women human rights defenders. And you will find this in our regional action plan, which is downloadable from the APF website. And I'll put a little link in the commentary box of today's webinar. So with regards to our action on promoting gender equality and mainstreaming the recognition of human rights defenders, we've discussed today there's a public acknowledgement in the Human Rights Defenders Declaration of the particular consideration required for women human rights defenders as an essential first step to mainstream their rights and deliver better protection outcomes. As a result, all APF members will work actively to support this recognition with their respective government counterparts. So women human rights defenders should be a central feature of awareness-raising campaigns advocacy programs for national legal protection, and other national actions that our members can support. APF members will ensure that the data on violations that they receive through their complaint handling process is disaggregated according to gender, and they'll document the extent to which gender contributes to a greater risk of violations. Now, we need to do that in cooperation with other data sources, and our colleagues at Forum Asia and ANNI in particular have also developed a sophisticated data monitoring mechanism, and we will need to work with Forum Asia in the collection on publication of that data. So in accordance with, the APF already has a gender equality strategy, and in accordance with that strategy, our members will also support gender mainstreaming in the context of the diverse series of gender identities. So trans and non-binary human rights defenders, of course, face even greater threats of violence and intimidation. To ensure these protection risks are mitigated and trans and non-binary human rights defenders are also given a voice, APF members will ensure that gender mainstreaming work includes targeted components on those subsets of human rights defenders. Now, colleagues, if you may, that kind of gives you me a presentation of what's included in the plan, but I'd like to just generally in the time I've got available, limited time I've got available, just respond to, I think, some of the central recommendations that have come out of today's report. So the question of representation and leadership within national human rights institutions was raised, the importance that leaders, the importance, number one, that within the leadership there is representation of women human rights defenders, number one, and two, that the leadership does take account of women human rights defenders. We've had my current colleague, at least for the next 9 days, Karen, speak on behalf of the Philippines Commission, and my former colleague, Ambika, speak on behalf of the Sri Lankan Commission about the activities that they undertook within their respective commissions. Now, leadership, I think Ambika raised the issue of leadership also is important in providing that the staff are aware, committed, have the processes to be able to undertake the work effectively and without bias. And Ambika, you used the word or the terminology of not being biased towards the state, not providing the state with the benefit of doubt with regards to this and attempting to take all of those complaints appropriately. I'd like to point to one particular activity that the APF will roll out as a part of this particular program, and that's a gender audit of national human rights institutions, processes and systems and activities. We're offering that to all of our member institutions now, where we'll be able to actually go through a process of determining, is there a particular policy with regards to women human rights defenders? How do the complaint handling processes that operate within the Commission take account of that policy and acknowledge that women human rights defenders have a particular have particular issues that need to be responded to by the national institution? Is there an appropriate awareness with regards to, within the staff complement of institutions to these procedures? Those types of issues will be undertaken within the gender audit. There are other aspects that were raised in the report, which I think my former colleagues have also spoken to, and that's the context of repressive laws within the situation that our members operate in. And you would have noted in the stats that were provided at the beginning of this presentation, about 25% of all cases that had been recorded by Forum Asia and ANNI were with regards to women human rights defenders. And the majority of those cases, there was some form of state actor involved as a result of the type of violation that was been undertaken. Unfortunately, the majority of that were judicial proceedings. And that goes to the heart of whether there's an appropriate legal structure within the state to recognise the importance of women human rights defenders and not act as an instrument of a violation, actually act as an instrument of protection. Now, there was the second largest component, which were from police, and presumably the operating procedures of police would give a large margin and wouldn't necessarily be totally regulated by administrative law or parliamentary legislation. And in that instance, I'd like to open it up through Shamira, if we could throw those types of questions to Amika and Karen. I know the Philippines in particular had a huge amount of role in recognising the complaint load that had come from the Philippines military, and had undertaken quite educative programs and employment-related programs which reduce that complaint load completely. Karen, it'd be interesting to get your view in the nature of how the institution can work with the police as well, in the context where, of course, we're seeing from these stats that many of the police officers involved are actually the perpetrators of the violations against women human rights defenders. The other questions that were raised were the question of trust building. I really appreciated Karen and Ambika's view. I can totally concur. If there is a lack of trust, that needs to be dealt with by the institution in developing processes, meetings, regular systems of cooperation at the national level to be able to build that trust. And we can see that that happens in many, many jurisdictions. You know, we only have to look back to the earlier days of Indonesia or the earlier days of Malaysia, or indeed the earlier days of both Sri Lanka and the Philippines. Well, I've got my colleagues here, and there would have been elements of distrust between civil society and national human rights institutions. And institutions have been able to work with their CSO colleagues to be able to build that trust over time. However, there is another point of the report, which is political upheaval within a nation state can lead to quite significant Paris Principles implications and threaten the independence of national human rights institutions. And I think, Ambika, you've illustrated that through the question of the 20th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution and the immediate impact that that's had, the perception that's had on the independence of the institution and its relationship with civil society. And again, these are things that largely reside outside of the capacity of a national institution. These are issues that reside with the state. But nonetheless, an institution can have a role in advising the state on those particular issues. So with that time, Shamira, I think I probably should leave it there. And I'd be really happy. I've noticed that we've had a couple of questions. I hope I've addressed some of the questions that were raised. There was one question which I hadn't, but if I could, just before I hand over the floor, there was a question of, do we need specific gender-based institutions or national human rights institutions? That was one of the issues raised. Or are specific institutions not necessarily the answer? Look, I personally think Komnas Perempuan is a fantastic institution doing brilliant work with Indonesia, far advanced of Komnas HAM and its ability to deal with gender-related work. Is it the best way of working? I don't think so, ultimately in the end, because it doesn't allow the gender mainstreaming and the indivisibility of human rights, and it somehow lets the institution, the human rights institution, off the hook if there's a specialised institution dealing with gender-based violence. And of course, within the Indonesian context, that specialised institution is provided with less funding and a more restricted legal mandate to be undertake its role. So there's strategies here that need to be discussed about what's the better way of proceeding with this. And I'm not going to say blankly that it's always bad to not have a specialised institution and she always should mainstream this work through a national human rights institution. I think it's really politically and context specific, but those would be the types of concerns I'd raise. So I think I've said enough and hand it over to you, Shamira. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiran. I think your presentation has tied in a lot of the points, of course, given a broad overview about APF's work and the regional action plan, but also just a reminder that any plan that is to be implemented is as strong as, our decisions to go ahead with implementing it wherever we can, whether it's CSOs, NHRIs. The plan is only effective when we go ahead and we do that. So thank you so much for your presentation. I think we have, of course, among all of our panelists covered a lot of the recommendations, concerns that our report has already highlighted. And once again, encouraging everyone to please have a look, please read it. It could be a good advocacy tool for the days ahead, but also about how we think about women human rights defenders issues in our own countries, how we can advocate more strongly within our national context, but also at the regional and international level. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for your unique viewpoints, your different perspectives on this issue. And as Kirtan has already mentioned, I think there are a few questions. We have a few minutes left. So there are a few questions. I think the first question was about violations against WHRDs that are mostly perpetrated by state actors like the police. And is there a scope for strengthening the relationship between states and NHRIs to facilitate better conversations with state actors about WHRDs? Or is it helpful to investigate into what is the relationship between states and NHRIs in the region? And I think, Ms. Ambika, since you already spoke about it, this would be a place where we would want to look at your opinions on this, hear from you. But also, I think in the interest of time, we'd request our panelists to keep it as succinct as possible, and we'll move on to the next questions. Thank you so much.
Yes. The problem, one of the main problems is that now, for instance, in Sri Lanka, the Human Rights Commission's decisions, because the Human Rights Commission cannot issue orders, it can only issue recommendations. So therefore, we find that the state does not take the recommendations of the Human Rights Commission seriously. This was so even when there was the good governance government previously. When I was a commissioner, it was better, much, much, much better. But a lot more needed to be done. And what they say is, it's because it's a recommendation, it's not an order. But in Sri Lanka, there is lack of respect for rule of law, which means sometimes even Supreme Court decisions are not adhered to. That said, I think, for instance, when I was in office, we did a study, and I think we found that around only 60% of our recommendations were implemented. So it is a problem between the entire state structure and the Human Rights Commission, not just the police. So I think it's not about strengthening the law of the commission, it's about changing attitudes so that people are actually outraged when the recommendations are not implemented. In relation to the police itself is an inherently, particularly in Sri Lanka's history, inherently violent, misogynist institution. It has also become militarized over the years due to the armed conflict. Therefore, training programs, engagement is not going to work. What we need is transformation and probably also dismantling it, dismantling parts of it and problematic portions of it. For that, we need to acknowledge that it has, as an institution itself, is problematic. To get the state to come to that point of realization is challenging, and that is where we must do the work.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ambika. Commissioner Karen, if you also have some examples and experience of the Philippines, please do share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I completely agree with Ambika on her sharing. But in the case of the Philippines, of course, we have a duty to be able to always engage with the police, even if, or the security sector and with government in general, even if they are actually, very aggressively against the human rights principles and standards. No? But one of the things that we'd like to say is that we do have a very strong education and training program with the security sector. And we have partnered with the security sector on this. So at least what we can do is really just try to ensure that if there is actual convergence on an issue, we do engage them, because that's part of our role. Even if they shut us out in investigation, surely they can engage us in human rights promotion work. But one of the things that we are also proud of, although it is part of the recommendatory functions of the commission, is we do have clearance systems where an officer who wants to get promoted as part of his requirements will need to get a clearance from the commission if they have records in the commission in terms of human rights complaints. And that has been proven somewhat more effective for individual officers of the security sector. But one of the innovations, I think, in the Philippines is really they do have human rights focus within the police and the military. One is the Human Rights Affairs Office within the police, and also the Center for Law of Armed Conflict in the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And we have been in constant touch with civil society actors through a program called Community-Based Dialogues. And we have harnessed that as a space for us to be able to build confidence and trust among each other. That's it for my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Karen. We had Kiran needed to leave for another meeting, but we do have a couple of other questions, which we hope that you can address. There's a question which says, many gender-based violence cases involving actors in the business sector. So to what extent the NHRI can engage in and advocate with companies to address this issue? And is there any effort that is initiated in the regional level where NHRIs are involved in advocating with business sectors, especially tech companies? Perhaps Commissioner Karen, Ambika, Vita, if you have any views on this, please do feel free to share from your own personal context. Thank you.
Perhaps I can go first. We do have, we're trying to convince government to already issue the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. But we do have our partnership with some private sector companies to be able to ensure capacity building within industries on business and human rights practices. And I can give you examples of that, or you can just visit our website through chr.gov.ph. I'll also post it here. Thanks.
Yes, in relation to business and human rights, it does, even here, we have a lot of sexual harassment, abuse happening in the private sector. Once again, we come back to the reluctance of people to complain about them, because when they go complain, it will not be taken seriously. And also they are afraid of reprisals, they're afraid of losing their jobs. So where NHRIs are concerned, what I mentioned before about inaction, creating an environment where people feel safe to complain, but also when the police don't take these complaints seriously, then inquire into the inaction by the police. We also have here, UNDP began the Business and Human Rights Dialogue, but it was just a dialogue. And in Sri Lanka, we've long experience of many action plans being constantly formulated and none of them being implemented. So one of the things that they could do, for instance, even through the Business and Human Rights Program that is UN funded, within the corporate sector, to set up sexual harassment policies, to set up inquiries, external panels to inquire into complaints, ensure there are protections against reprisals. Things like that would be important. Thank you.
Thank you both, Commissioner Karen and Ambika. And I think there was a last question which spoke about, is establishing a separate human rights institution like the Komnas Perempuan, beneficial? Is it going to be a way forward in the protection of women's rights and girls' rights, or does it contradict the goals of gender mainstreaming? So I think Kiran did address this, his own personal opinion to some extent. I'm not sure if there is a lot of time right now to get in, because I think this would differ from context to context and country to country. But that being said, I think through this discussion, and if I may wrap up, through this discussion, I'm sorry, Vita, did you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, missed that question. In Indonesia, Komnas HAM has special attention to business and human rights. And then seeing their past work, Komnas HAM can investigate the actual and potential impact on business activity to human rights protection. However, it is still manufacture and extractive industry heavy. So it's still a long way to go to assess the technology sector, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vita, and my apologies, I didn't see you unmuted yourself. But thanks a lot for your thoughts on this as well. But I think the last question, as we've already discussed, I think there will be a lot of debate on this. We will have to see from context to context and country to country. But thank you so much to all of our panelists and everyone who stayed on to attend this wonderful event. We've learned a lot. We've received a lot of different kinds of perspectives on this issue. But at the end of the day, I think we can safely say there is a lot of work to be done. The situation in Asia continues to remain dire for women human rights defenders, but several points have been touched upon, especially about administrative will, human rights education, and in implementing, all programs and policies with the gender responsive and gender sensitive measures. And I think this is a key takeaway for all of us here, that we will have to work together inevitably to ensure that there are stronger protection mechanisms for WHRDs in Asia. So thank you so much to everyone who's attended, our speakers once again. And I pass the mic to Julio to wrap up the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamira. So I will not take too much of your time because I know that we have passed the time limit for this event. I would like to say thank you again, first of all, for my team from Asia, for our colleagues from the HRD program, and then also for the speakers, Karen, Vita, Ambika, as well as Kieran, for your amazing insights. I think we have made a really insightful discussion. We have answered to some of the questions that have been raised by the participants. And I would like to also extend my thank you to all who have participated actively, while also passively, it's okay. We enjoyed your participation inside of this discussion. And we know that gender mainstreaming, women human rights defender protection, and of course, all individuals who are a part of the marginality spectrum, those require more attention and also more affirmative action, as well as further support, especially by those who are working in human rights sectors and also national human rights institutions. So we know the importance and the risk that they are facing in order for them to continue their work. And this report definitely highlights what needs to be done between the civil society elements, as well as the national human rights institutions and other regional organizations to better extend and offer our support for women human rights defenders. So thank you very much for your participation. We hope that this report is of use to all of us here as a reference, as an advocacy tool, and we can advance the protection and also the support for women human rights defenders and NHRIs in working on women human rights defender issues in the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.